And so, my fellow Americans,
You are eager to speak about aggression in Cuba. Your job is speak about defending Cuba.
ask not what your country can do for you.
USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba.
The office of President of the United States.
Ask what you can do for your country.
Fidel Castro entered the stage of history at a young age. In 1946, Fidel Castro was 20 years old and attending Havana University. He delivered a speech attacking Cuban President Ramon Grau for corruption and violence. News of his speech was on the front page of several Cuban newspapers. Castro had always been idealistic and was not afraid to make sure his point was heard. He was passionately anti-imperialist and opposed American intervention in Cuba. Over time, Castro leaned further and further to the left, eventually reading Marx's works and becoming a communist. Castro had long believed that the Cuban president was corrupt, and he believed that the President Grau's successor, Batista, fit the description as well. In 1953, Castro organized an armed rebellion in an attempt to start a revolution. The attempt failed and Castro was imprisoned. Batista gave Castro amnesty, hoping it would be good publicity in a time where Batista had become a de facto dictator. In a final attempt to overthrow Batista's dictatorship, Castro and his brother Raul went to Mexico where they met up with the Dr. Che Guevara. The three traveled back to Cuba in 1956 where they waged a guerrilla war against Batista's regime. Castro's men would treat the injuries of Batista's soldiers and gain the support from the masses at the mercy of men just following orders. The Cuban army was unable to gain the upper hand in guerrilla warfare, and Castro's rebellion reached Havana that summer with the help of large numbers of defecting soldiers. The United States realized that Castro was going to be the man at the head of Cuba and, fearing he was a communist, tried to prevent him from becoming the president by appointing a judge instead. Castro invaded the capital, but his rebels made sure that no looting took place. After the rebellion, trials were held for the perpetrators of Batista's war crimes.
This sports palace in a circus atmosphere. Spectators jammed the arena, some yelling, "Kill him," as Batista men came to the bench. The trials went quickly. Within a few weeks, 250 men faced firing squads throughout the country.
The U.S. protested that the trials were unjust. In response, Castro gave the following statement: "Revolutionary justice is not based on legal precepts, but on moral conviction." Castro was an idealist and a romantic, and his actions in 1961 and 62 proved this. In 1960, Castro ordered oil refineries in Cuba to process oil imported from the Soviets. U.S. companies ran the refineries and refused to comply. As a result of American intervention, Castro nationalized all of the oil refineries. The U.S. then refused to buy Cuban sugar, prompting Castro to nationalize that industry as well. The United States came to the conclusion that Cuba was going to be a communist country and could not accept such a danger 90 miles from mainland America. Something had to be done. On April 17, 1961, the CIA-sponsored Brigade 2506 launched an amphibious invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs with 1,400 Cuban exiles.
The CIA had organized the training of the guerrillas and had forcefully advocated the invasion. The Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Secretary of Defense had approved its military aspects, and the Secretary of State had approved its political aspects. Yet, everything went wrong.
The Cuban military knew that an American invasion was planned that week and repelled the attack in 3 days. Instead of executing the exiles, Castro imprisoned them and negotiated for $43 million worth of baby food and medicine in exchange for the return of the exiles. The American plan had failed, and worse than that, it had pushed Castro and his socialist Cuba into the arms of Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. Leaders in Moscow had long been looking for a way to get ahead in the arms race between America and the Soviets. The West had nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy that could flatten Moscow. The Soviets could barely touch America and could hit no targets in the contiguous United States with any accuracy. Cuba could change all that. Khrushchev offered Castro the chance he was looking for. With Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles, Castro could threaten with striking the U.S. capital in order to prevent an invasion. However, it was not so simple for Castro. His advisors pressed him to take this new opportunity, but he was hesitant. He did not want to trade one imperial power meddling in Cuba for another. He sided with the Soviets, but did not necessarily trust them. Castro finally agreed with his advisors, as he believed an invasion was otherwise inevitable. He had to stand up to America. The missiles were shipped across the Atlantic in the summer of 1962, along with anti-aircraft missiles and missiles designed to destroy naval vessels near the coast of Cuba. In an attempt to keep the nuclear missiles in the deal secret, only the Castro brothers and Che Guevara knew this plan in Cuba, and only the highest tier of Soviet officials knew in the East. The secrecy proved ineffective against the American spy plane, the U-2 Dragon Lady. High-altitude flyovers revealed the missile sites, and President Kennedy was notified on October 15, 1962.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Following the public announcement from Kennedy that he knew and would not tolerate the missiles in Cuba, talk began between the Soviets and America, but not between Cuba and the two larger powers. Castro felt that both nations were pushing Cuba aside in their negotiations. Cuba's military was not permitted to operate the Soviet weapons. Instead, Soviet soldiers and officials operated them. Castro believed that the United States would attack again, and that it would be a full-scale invasion with all of the military might of the nation. Castro and his advisors knew that Cuba could not stand up to such an attack. Castro received a message relayed from the U.S. government from the Brazilian ambassador in Cuba. The ambassador told him that if the missiles were removed, then an invasion was unlikely. This said two things to Castro. First, if an invasion was unlikely if the missiles were removed, then America must intend to invade if they were not. Second, the United States, his enemy, had included him more in negotiations than the Soviet Union, his ally. Castro believed an attack was highly likely. All of his reforms would be for nothing. Instead of negotiating, Castro took his final stand for the rights of Cuba and his regime. Feeling backed into a corner, Castro sent a letter to Khrushchev on October 26, requesting a nuclear strike on Washington, D.C. We all know the history here. Castro's request fails, and the missiles are removed from Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis ends with negotiations between America and the USSR. Castro was furious with the outcome. His country had been used by its closest ally in a failed attempt to look strong. He was reported to have flew into a rage upon hearing the news. Despite this outrage, he had to continue to ally with the Soviets. Economically and strategically, he needed them.